They say no one ever crossed the Comanche lands without leaving blood behind. But that morning, she crossed it alone. She was no older than 15, barefoot. One braid torn loose, the other tangled with burrs and dried blood. Her prairie dress hung like a rag on a scarecrow torn at the shoulder, stained dark at the thigh. She didn't knock. She didn't cry. She just stood in the ranch yard, staring at the wooden porch with eyes full of dust and ghosts. Then she whispered one word. No one heard it but the wind, and collapsed. Inside, the rancher had been boiling coffee. Same as every morning, same cup, same stove, same silence. He didn't run out when he heard the thud. He walked slow, cautious, like a man who's seen death wear too many faces to rush toward a new one. He found her curled like a question mark on the dirt. One leg bent at an odd angle, her breathing shallow, like wind over dying coals. In her fist a feather, not white, not decorative, but gray, torn, dipped in something dark ink, or blood. Maybe both. He didn't touch her at first, just crouched beside her, one knee pressing into the dry earth. For a long moment, neither moved. He'd buried his own daughter 11 years ago. Same size, same skin, different world. The girl stirred, just barely. A sound escaped her lips, a broken syllable, swallowed by pain. Her hand twitched, feather dragging through dust like a dying signature. Something inside him cracked. Not loudly, just enough. He scooped her up. She didn't weigh more than a sack of feed, bones sharp through skin, shoulder blades like broken wings. Her blood smeared his sleeve. But he didn't flinch. He didn't even wipe it away. Instead, he carried her across the threshold of a house that hadn't seen a guest in 3 winters. The dog didn't bark. The wind didn't stir. Time paused. He laid her down on the couch he never used, on a quilt older than memory, then stood back, hat still on, hands dangling like forgotten tools. What the hell was a Comanche girl doing out here alone, wounded, silent? He didn't ask. He went for water. In the kitchen, he poured it slow, warmed it with honey, brought it back and placed the tin cup near her mouth. Her lips didn't move. Not yet. Then he noticed her feet were blistered raw, her toenails cracked, a small strip of cloth tied around her ankle like a charm embroidered with something. Words, maybe, but not in English. He crouched again, lifted her wrist. No pulse, no weight. There it was, barely. A bird's heartbeat, faint. But there. She was alive, and so was something in him he thought had died. Outside, the sun crawled higher, heating the yard until the dust shimmered. The neighbors might have seen her, might have said something. But out here, nobody interferes unless there's something to gain. And she didn't look like profit. She looked like trouble. But the rancher didn't send her away, because he recognized the look in her eyes before they closed. The look of someone who hadn't been rescued, but had run. From what? He didn't know. But the answer was coming. It always does. As she lay unconscious, her grip on the feather never loosened. Not once. Even when he tried to clean her hands, her fingers locked tight around it. He could have forced it, but he didn't. Some things, he knew, aren't meant to be taken, only offered. He left her water, changed the bloodied cloth on her thigh, and then, with slow hands, built a small fire not because it was cold, but because silence without warmth was worse than pain. Then he waited. Night came. Coyotes cried. The moon rose hard and bright, lighting the room through a crack in the window. She hadn't moved, but he didn't sleep. He sat across from her, feather in her fist glowing faintly silver in the moonlight. And he thought of his daughter. 11 years gone. She used to hold feathers too, but never like that. In the deep hour of night, the girl stirred, just once. She opened her eyes not wide, not in terror, but in that dazed, drowning way of someone halfway between memory and now. Her gaze landed on the rancher, and stayed, not afraid, not grateful, just there. Then she whispered a second word. This time, he heard it. Papa. But it wasn't for him, and he knew that. Still, it pierced something he'd buried beneath layers of quiet. He said nothing, just nodded, then got up and walked to the porch, lit a cigarette, listened to the wind shift direction, and missed the moment she sat up straight and stared out the window toward the east, where, far beyond the hills, 99 black horses were beginning to ride. The next morning came without birdsong, only the sound of old hinges groaning as he opened the front door, slow, deliberate, as if inviting trouble in would make it easier to face. She was still asleep, close to it. Her chest rose in short, uncertain breaths. The feather was still in her hand. The quilt he'd draped over her had slipped to her knees, revealing fresh bruises beneath older ones, layered like sediment in a forgotten canyon. He didn't ask what happened, not because he wasn't curious, because he knew what people could do. He poured her another cup of warm water, set it on the stool by her side, then took a step back and let the silence fill the room again. A silence so thick it made the ticking of the wall clock sound like gunfire. He didn't know if she understood English. He didn't even know if she knew where she was. But he stayed. Because the last time he hadn't, someone had died. Word spreads like lightning out here. The town was 8 miles south. But by noon, someone had already come riding up the trail. Mrs. Cartwright, church lady, sharp eyes, sharper tongue. She didn't knock either. Just opened the gate, walked straight up the porch with her parasol tapping the planks like a judge's gavel. "I heard you got company," she said, squinting into the darkened doorway. "And not the white kind." He didn't answer, just leaned against the post and looked at her the same way he'd look at a dead coyote with quiet calculation. "I hope you know what kind of war you're inviting." Still no answer. "Well, it's your land," she added, biting off the words. "But they'll come for her. They always do." She turned on her heel and left. And he let her. Inside, the girl was sitting up now. Not fully, but enough. Her eyes wandered across the room like she was seeing it for the first time or remembering it from a dream she once had. He stepped back in, careful not to startle her. Removed his hat. She didn't flinch. That was new. He sat on the floor this time. Same level, no boots, no noise, just him, her, and the soft creak of wood cooling in the shadows. He pointed to himself. "Jack." She didn't speak. He pointed again, this time to her. "Nothing?" Then she held up the feather, pressed it to her lips, and whispered a name, Neha. It hung there between them, delicate and unfinished. He repeated it softly, Neha. Her shoulders sagged. A breath escaped her lips, one that might have been relief or surrender. Then, for the first time, she looked him in the eyes, that night. He moved her to the spare room, laid a basin of warm water near the cot, a folded towel, and a small comb from his late wife's drawer. She didn't use any of it, just stared at the ceiling like it held secrets only she could see. Outside, the wind howled low and mean. Jack sat by the fireplace, eyes fixed on the coals. His rifle leaned against the wall, loaded. He didn't know what kind of people would hurt a girl like that, but he knew they weren't done with her yet, and that meant they weren't done with him either. He dreamed of his daughter that night, not the way she was in the end, with fever and fear, but how she used to be, barefoot, laughing, running through dust storms like they were playgrounds, holding out feathers she'd found turkey, hawk, dove, and saying, "This one's lucky, Pa." When he woke, Neha was gone, the bed empty, the door wide open. He grabbed his boots without socks, sprinted into the yard with nothing but instinct guiding him. But she wasn't far, just standing at the edge of the corral, arms resting on the top rail, staring at the sky. She didn't look at him, just spoke. "Horse," she said softly, pointing toward the morning horizon. "Black, with white eye." He followed her finger. Nothing, but he didn't question her. Because sometimes people see things the rest of us aren't ready for, and she'd already crossed farther distances than most men could survive. Later that day, he saddled up the mule and rode to town. Bought flour, salt, bandages, 2 new quilts. When the store clerk asked about the girl, Jack just said she's staying. The man raised an eyebrow. But Jack didn't explain because some truths are too long to fit in a conversation. By the time he got back, Neha was asleep again. The basin had been used, the comb left on the windowsill. Her hair, now clean, shimmered dark in the candlelight. And in the center of the kitchen table, the feather, laid flat, beside it, carved carefully into the wood with a paring knife. A horse, black, with one white eye. She sat at the table like it was an altar, back straight, hands folded, head low, as if one wrong move would summon punishment from some god he couldn't see. Jack placed the bowl in front of her, warm porridge with honey and a splash of goat's milk. Nothing fancy, nothing spicy, just soft, just safe. She didn't touch it. He waited. She stared at the spoon like it was a snake coiled in ceramic. Her fingers twitched, then retracted. Her lips pressed into a tight line, and her gaze flicked to the doorway. Not toward escape, but toward consequence. Jack took a breath, slow and steady. Then, without a word, he sat across from her, picked up his own spoon, ate, 1 bite, 2, 3. Nothing happened. No scolding, no thunder. He looked at her again, eyes kind but quiet. And for a second, just a second, she moved, lifted the spoon halfway, then dropped it. The clatter sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She flinched so hard the chair scraped backward, and she froze, like prey waiting to be struck. Jack didn't move. He just said, softly, "No one's gonna hit you here." Her breath caught, like the words had slapped her harder than a fist ever could. She looked up, tears threatening, but not falling. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed, one short, bitter sound, like she'd heard the same promise before, right before it broke. He left the bowl there, didn't push it toward her, didn't say her name, just left the room. Slow, boots careful on the floorboards. From the porch, he could still see her through the open door. She didn't eat, not yet. But she touched the spoon again, and held it. The next morning, he tried bread, soft, warm, torn in pieces. He placed it on a napkin instead of a plate. She ate half. By dusk, she'd finished the whole thing, didn't say a word, but her hands trembled less. That night, Jack whittled a piece of cedar wood into a horse figurine, rough, simple, uneven. He wasn't a carver, but he wanted to leave something by her door, something to say, "I see you," without saying anything at all. When he placed it on the floor outside her room, he noticed something strange. There was another carving already leaning against the wall. A second horse, painted with ashes and berry juice. Not his work. Hers. He picked it up, turned it over, and underneath, a single line scratched into the belly, "Don't be afraid." He didn't know if it was for her or for him. Maybe both. The next day, she helped him clean the chicken coop, didn't speak, but didn't flinch from the noise either. When one of the hens pecked her wrist, she winced but didn't cry out. Jack moved toward her fast, half expecting her to bolt, but she just looked at him and said, "Calm as dawn, I'm not made of feathers." It was the first joke she'd ever told. He laughed, out loud, and something heavy inside him loosened. That evening, she asked if she could help make supper. He let her. She washed the potatoes, burned the first batch of cornbread, then tried again. And when she set the browned crust on the table, proud but silent, Jack took the first bite with ceremony. "Best I've ever had," he said. She rolled her eyes, but she smiled too, small, real, like a flower blooming between cracks in stone. They didn't talk about who she was running from. They didn't talk about his daughter either. But sometimes when the wind howled through the windows and the fire crackled loud, they'd sit on the floor, back to back, and just breathe. 2 ghosts learning how to haunt a house together. On the 4th night, she asked for paper. He gave her an old ledger book, mostly empty. She drew, not people, not places, but shapes, symbols, and horses. Always horses, running, standing, fading, one with wings, one with a single eye, each image more detailed than the last, each one a voice, louder than her own. And Jack began to understand, but it wasn't just art. It was memory, and warning, and hope. Every stroke a piece of a puzzle too fragile for words, every page a step closer to something neither of them could name yet. Then came the morning when she cleared the table without being asked, washed the bowls, hung the towel on the rail, and left the wooden horse he'd made her on the windowsill facing outward, like a lookout or a farewell. But when he asked if she was planning to leave, she shook her head. No, she said, not until the last horse arrives. And with that, she walked outside barefoot still, but stronger now, and began painting on the barn wall. The first image, a horse, black, running, and from its mane a single red feather trailing in the wind. At first he thought it was a child's game. The black horse on the barn wall stood out sharp against the sun-bleached planks painted with strokes that were somehow both rough and reverent. Its legs bent mid-stride, eyes hollow, mouth open like it had screamed before the brush froze. He didn't stop her, didn't ask where she got the black paint, didn't tell her that barn had stood unmarked since the day he built it with his own 2 hands, back when he believed in permanence, because something about the way she painted slow, determined, focused like a prayer, told him this wasn't a decoration. It was a message. Or a memory. Or both. By evening there were 3 horses, all black, all mid-run, each in a slightly different stance. The second one's flank was scored with white scratches and the third had blood dripping from its mouth, just 2 drops, vivid red, running down the wood like the wall itself was bleeding. She said nothing, just kept painting. He brought her supper on the porch and watched her from the rocker. The old chair creaked beneath his weight, and the sky went gold around them. She only looked up once. Every night, they ride one more in, she said. He didn't understand, not yet, but the hairs on his neck stirred anyway. Who, he asked. She dipped her brush into the makeshift pot ash, oil, and crushed elderberry. My father rides last. Then she stood and walked into the house like she hadn't just cracked the earth beneath him. He slept badly that night, dreamed of hoofbeats, distant at first, then closer, thundering. He woke with sweat on his collarbone and silence so deep it rang. He checked the barn. 5 horses now. The 5th had a broken leg, bent unnaturally, its eye wide with fear. The paint still wet. She wasn't outside. He found her in the kitchen, making tea, calm as water. She looked up when he entered and said, "They're remembering me." He nodded slowly, then asked, "Are they angry?" Her hand trembled for a moment, then stilled. "No," she said. "Worse, they're deciding." By midweek, there were 13 horses on the wall, all facing east, all galloping. Jack didn't say a word. He just sharpened his axe and fixed the hinges on the shed door, things that made no sense until you realized that waiting for a storm meant shoring up everything that might break when it hit. Neha moved less now, spent more time drawing, less time speaking. She sketched maps he couldn't decipher, wrote in a language he didn't recognize, symbols he had no name for but which made the back of his throat tighten when he looked too long. One night, she painted until the stars came out. Jack lit the lantern and sat beside her. When she finished the 22nd horse, he said, "Is there an end?" She didn't answer, just dipped the brush again, and added a red handprint to the flank of the 23rd. Small, child-sized, hers. The next morning, a hawk circled the property, landed on the post above the corral and stared at the house with its head cocked like a question. Neha stood beneath it for an hour, didn't move, didn't blink. When Jack tried to approach, she raised her hand not to stop him, but to protect the silence between them. That day, she painted 6 more horses, no eyes, just blank sockets, and painted war symbols across their chests. Jack couldn't ignore the truth anymore. This wasn't art, it was a countdown. That evening, he oiled his rifle, loaded every round, then unloaded it again. He wouldn't shoot her people, he couldn't. But he couldn't just stand aside either. He watched her from the doorway as she painted horse number 40. It had wings, not bird wings, but something wilder, sharper, like the wind had learned how to gallop. She looked tired, more bone than girl. But she didn't stop, didn't waver. And when she turned to him, brush dripping, she said, "You'll know when he's near?" How he asked. She handed him the feather, now dyed red at the tip. "It'll burn," she said, "but don't drop it." Jack didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with his boots on and the feather in his hand, watching the wind, listening, praying in a language he didn't remember learning, one word at a time. At dawn, he walked to the barn, stopped, stared. 98 horses now. The last one not yet painted sounded him, but the space was ready. Wide, empty, waiting, inside the house. Neha was drawing on his daughter's old quilt. Delicate lines, careful strokes. When he knelt beside her, she whispered, "Tomorrow," then paused. "My father's name is Bear That Waits," and Jack felt the name hit like thunder behind his ribs. "What does he wait for?" he asked. Neha didn't answer. She just reached up and touched his chest, right over the heart, then walked outside to finish the final horse. The rain came first. Not a full downpour, just that slow, quiet kind that smells like metal and regret. It started as Neha painted the 99th horse. She stood with one hand on the barn wall, the other clutching the brush, her knees trembling like a sapling in wind. But she didn't stop, didn't blink, didn't flinch. Jack watched from the porch, feather still in hand. The red tip had begun to darken. He didn't know how or why, only that it was happening. By dusk, the storm had gathered its throat. Clouds stacked in angry rows above the horizon. The smell of firewood and coming judgment filled the air. Jack lit the lanterns inside the house, set out dry clothes, laid the shotgun on the counter. Not loaded, just present. He boiled water, cut apples, roasted the last of the venison, and waited. The last time he'd prepared a meal with this much care, it was his daughter's 11th birthday. The same night she rode off behind the cabin saying she was chasing lightning bugs and never came back. Now. Another girl sat at his table, not his blood, but somehow more familiar than the ghosts who haunted these walls. She barely touched the food. Took a single slice of apple, bit it twice, then set it down like it was made of glass. Then she stood, quietly, walked into his daughter's old room, and lay down beneath the quilt with the stitched eagle flying across faded stars. Jack followed after a moment, stood in the doorway, watching her like he might wake up if he blinked. She spoke without looking at him. "He's here." Jack's heart didn't jump. It sank. Like an anchor. "He won't take me if I don't want to go," she added. "But he'll ask?" Jack stepped inside, sat beside the bed. No words between them for a long stretch of time. Just the sound of the storm rolling nearer. Thunder distant but growing teeth. Neha reached out, slowly, uncertain, and took his hand, held it tight. Not like a daughter, not like a child, but like someone who saw the storm and still chose to stay near its edge. Jack swallowed something hard. "You don't have to run anymore," he said. She turned her head, met his eyes, and whispered, "I didn't run, I walked. I followed the stars, and they brought me here." The rain struck hard then, fast, sharp, angry. It beat against the windows like fists. Neha sat up in bed. The candle flickered on the nightstand. She touched his wrist right over the vein and said, "You should rest." He didn't move, just asked, "What happens if I stand between him and you?" She looked down, then said barely above a breath, "He'll ask you to bleed." Jack nodded, like it was fair, like he'd expected nothing less. He waited until she fell asleep, then stood guard on the porch, feather still in hand, the red tip now warm. Not hot, but warming, like a coal deep in the palm. His knuckles whitened. He thought of all the ways this could go wrong, of men riding through fences, torches in hand, of blades drawn before names were spoken. But more than anything, he thought of Neha's voice, soft and cracked, telling him the stars brought her here, and that was enough. The storm broke just before dawn, and with it, silence shattered. From beyond the hills came hoofbeats, not fast, not panicked, measured, purposeful. Jack stood. The feather in his hand glowed red, not with fire, but with something older, a warning, or a permission. He tucked it into his coat pocket, walked into the yard, no rifle, no hat, just a man walking into a story that hadn't been written yet. On the hill beyond the east fence they appeared. First the horses, rows of them, silent, painted, seething without a sound. Then the riders, Comanche. Everyone, war-painted faces, bows slung, eyes fixed, 99 of them. Neha stepped out behind Jack, barefoot, no paint, just her hand on his shoulder. Then the last horse stepped forward, big, gray, eyes like thunderclouds, ridden by a man with white streaks in his black hair. A bear claw necklace across his chest, and in his gaze something bottomless. He dismounted, walked 10 paces toward the rancher, stopped, held out a red feather, then waited. Jack reached into his coat, brought out Neha's feather, raised it once. The two men stood like statues. Then at the exact same time both lowered the feathers to the ground, laid them gently in the dirt, and stepped back. No war cry, no blood, just a breath passed between warriors, and something ancient settled. Peace. Bear that waits looked at his daughter, said nothing, just nodded. Once, sharp, and turned, mounted, and rode away. The others followed, not a single hoof out of place, not a single glance back, until the dust swallowed them whole. Jack didn't speak. Neha didn't cry. But her hand never left his shoulder, even after the hoofbeats were gone. Even after the sun broke the horizon like forgiveness. Even after the storm was a memory. The next morning, there was dew on the grass and smoke in the air. Not fire, just the scent of it. The kind that clings to memory more than skin. The kind that reminds you something happened. Even if there's no ash left behind. Jack stood by the barn, staring at the 99th horse. It was complete now. Red streak across its chest. One eye painted with a swirling symbol he didn't recognize. But the strange thing was, it looked like it was moving. Not literally, not magic, but something about it, its angle, its position. The way its hooves seemed to break the wood just right, it gave the illusion that it was running. Towards something. Or away. He didn't know which. Inside the house, Neha was awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor, a bowl of corn in her lap. Her fingers sorting kernels into careful little piles, white, yellow, bad, better. She looked up when he entered and said, with a voice that no longer trembled, "I need seeds, good ones." He raised an eyebrow. "For planting?" She nodded. "Down by the creek. The soil remembers." Jack let that sit between them for a second, then replied, "So do I." By midday, the town knew what had happened. They didn't ride out to see the barn, didn't send letters or make accusations, but Jack could feel their silence thickening around his land like mist off the river, heavy. Cold, full of things left unsaid. He went into town anyway, took the wagon, picked up flour, salt, nails, and 3 sacks of seed corn. The clerk rang it up without looking him in the eye. But as Jack turned to leave, the man cleared his throat and said, "I'd have shot first." Jack didn't answer, didn't slow, just walked out and whispered under his breath, "That's why no one trusts you." When he got home, Neha was on the roof of the chicken coop, painting, a large black shape, wings, not a bird, something else. He climbed up slowly, handed her a cloth to clean her fingers, and said, "Town's quiet." She shrugged. "They're watching." "You scared?" She looked him straight in the face. "No," then smiled a little. but maybe they are. That night, he sat by the fireplace with her. She was drawing again on fabric this time, an old scrap from one of his work shirts. She stitched the red feather carefully, one thread at a time. Then below it, a phrase. In English, blocky, uneven letters, but clear. No one shoots first. Jack stared at it for a long time, then said, "That's supposed to be a threat." Neha shook her head. At dawn, Jack rode out, not to escape but to be seen. He passed 3 farms, didn't wave, didn't nod. He wanted them to feel it, the presence of a man who hadn't knelt, not to fear, not to expectation, just to love. Because that's what it was now. This wasn't about pity or protection. It was about choosing someone even when you know the cost. When he came back, Neha had started clearing the creek bank, with a shovel too big for her frame, sweat on her forehead, dirt under her nails. He didn't stop her, just grabbed a second shovel and dug beside her for hours, until their hands bled, until the sun painted shadows long and thin across the land, until the silence between them became something sacred. That evening, a rider came, alone, an old man, Comanche, tall as a tree, with braids like river ropes and a gaze full of thunder. He didn't dismount, just stopped at the fence and waited. Jack walked out, hat in hand. The old man nodded toward the barn. "Horse painting's yours." Jack shook his head. "Girls," the man grunted. "Thought so." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a pouch, tossed it to Jack. Jack opened it. "Seeds, blue corn, rare. Gift," the man said, "for the one who didn't shoot," then rode off without another word. Neha planted them that night, said they only grow under moonlight, said they remember the sound of hooves better than water. Jack didn't argue, just sat by the edge of the creek and watched her move like the land was listening. And maybe it was, because the wind that night was soft, and the stars looked closer than usual. Before bed, she hung the stitched fabric over the fireplace, the red feather, the words, "No one shoots first." Jack stared at it for a long time and thought of his daughter, how different it all could have been. How some men build fences, and others, when the time comes, open the gate. Spring didn't arrive with flowers. It arrived with mud, with frost still clinging to the north side of the barn and the river coughing up old branches and bones of winter. But it was still spring, because the ground had softened, and things could finally grow. Neha rose early now, earlier than Jack. She lit the stove before he even stirred, ground corn by hand, hung herbs from the windowsill, talked to the chickens like they were old friends. He watched from the porch, coffee in hand, wondering how someone so quiet could make a house feel so alive and so permanent, like she'd always been there. The barn wall still bore the 99 horses, faded now, weather-bitten, but still there. Every visitor passed it. None asked about it, because something in those images warned them not to, or maybe asked them to listen instead of speak. Jack built her a new room, not because she asked, because one morning she said, "This house has only 1 bedroom, but we're 2 people now." So he sawed, hammered, sanded, and stained, and when it was done, she didn't say thank you. She just slept there, and left a small totem above the door, a carved stone horse with no eyes and a mouth wide open. He never asked what it meant. He just nodded every time he passed it. One day, she came home with a rabbit, alive, cradled in her arms like a baby onaku. Found it in a trap. She said, "Its leg's broken." Jack looked at it, matted fur, eyes dull with fear. "Won't live long." She looked at him, then simply said, "I'm not asking it to." He made a splint out of kindling, and the rabbit lived. The blue corn sprouted on the first day of May, tiny green shoots. Stubborn against the wind, Neha danced beside them in her bare feet, moving slowly, arms raised, not in ritual, not in show, but in gratitude. Jack didn't join her, he just watched. and smiled like a man who'd finally learned how to see color again. On the porch, above the steps, they hung a new symbol, 2 feathers, bound at the stem, one red, one gray. When travelers passed, they asked if it meant safe. Jack always replied the same way. Only if you come with your hands open, and the townsfolk stayed away. Not out of hatred, but reverence, because something in that house made them remember things they weren't ready to face. Things like mercy, like restraint, like not shooting first. And sometimes, those were the hardest things to carry. Neha rarely spoke of her father, but once, while watching a fire burn low, she said, "He'll never come back." Jack asked why. She paused, then answered, "Because he knows I found something he never could." "What's that?" "A place where silence doesn't mean fear." Jack built a bench beside the creek. They sat there sometimes, not every day, but enough. She would braid dried grass, he would whittle, and they'd let the river talk. Because some wounds don't close with words, only with presence and time. On the final day of summer, Neha handed him a wrapped bundle. Inside a blanket, soft sky blue, with the red feather stitched into the center, around it, 99 horses in a circle, but the middle was empty. He looked up. She said, "That's where we are." He asked, "Alone?" She shook her head. "Safe." When winter came, it didn't feel cruel. Even when the wind howled, even when snow swallowed the trails, the house was warm and full. And when the wind knocked on the shutters, it found no one afraid, because the people inside had already survived the storm that matters, the one inside the soul. Years later, they still spoke little, but their gestures grew rich with meaning. A nod, a shared glance, a cup of tea set down just so. He taught her to ride, she taught him to dream again, and neither needed to say thank you, because every breath they shared was thanks enough. Sometimes, strangers still came, lost, scared, chased by something unseen. They would see the barn, see the feathers, see the painted horses, and they would stop and knock, and Neha would answer the door. Sometimes Jack behind her, sometimes not. And they would say, "Is this the place?" And she would nod, then say the words that had once been said to her. No one shoots first, and the door would open, and the silence would welcome them in. There are homes we're born into, and then there are homes we build from broken things out of silence, pain, and second chances. Jack and Neha found each other not through words, but through choices. He chose not to turn away. She chose not to run. And together, they built something sacred in a world that too often rewards fear over kindness. In this world, many people are taught to strike first, to assume the worst, to protect their heart by locking the door. But what if the real strength lies in opening it and waiting before pulling the trigger, in listening before judging, in seeing someone's wounds without asking how they got them? We all carry storms inside, but sometimes healing isn't about fixing the storm, it's about finding someone who doesn't run from the thunder. And if we're lucky, we'll meet someone who teaches us that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up, paints horses on our walls, and refuses to let us be afraid. So if today you're carrying something heavy, remember this: no one shoots first, in a house built by compassion. And that might just be the safest place in the world.